Thank you, Mr Deputy Chair, and it's with pleasure that I rise to speak on this bill in the House tonight. It's a pleasure only in the sense that my comments come from a place of concern about the legislation being put before the House this evening, and concern that is based upon both evidence that has come before respective committees of this parliament, but also the experiences of Indigenous men and women who have talked to me about the implications of this proposal in their communities and concerns around the expansion of such proposed trials into new communities. Mr Deputy Speaker, of course, this bill before us is in fact the Social Securities Legislation Amendment Cashless Debit Card Bill of 2017. And in this bill, in essence, this bill is seeking to remove Section 124PF of the Social Security Act, which is the one that currently provides for the trial sites for the cashless debit cards in 3 discrete locations, puts a cap on there being no more than 10,000 participants, and in fact expires on the 30th of June this year. I guess the bill seeks to allow for, it seeks to make this amendment to allow for these both the continuation in the existing sites and potential expansion of the cashless debit card into further new locations, but regretfully does so on the basis of, at best, very flimsy evidence. And that is a real problem for us as lawmakers and policymakers, where we do not have substantive evidence before us to be able to say, these measures are meeting the delivered outcomes, that there were clear purposes set down for the cashless debit card, and there have been terrific measured outcomes, and that you could see the genuine social, cultural and economic sort of advantages of this cashless debit card. But we don't have any of that before us, and so I have, like my Labor colleagues who are speaking to this bill today, have grave concerns about a number of aspects in this bill. I am deeply concerned about the non-voluntary nature of the measures in this bill. I am also deeply concerned about the clearly disproportionate impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and those who don't have drug, alcohol or gambling concerns, of which in these communities there are, of course, many, many. But this sort of, throw a big wide net, capture everybody in a community under this one sort of very blunt instrument of the cashless debit card, that kind of approach sweeps up everybody, and in doing so completely disempowers so many people in those communities. I could not even begin to imagine what it would be like to have, spent my life, trying to determine the futures of myself and my own families, to be an autonomous human being, to be a great contributor to my community, perhaps being a leader in that community, having to now forego all of that autonomy because the government prefers to cast the wide net and throw, one very blunt instrument at what is a very deep historical, social and economic challenge in many of our communities. To me, Mr Deputy Speaker, that is the essence of lazy policy making. That is an example of a government that has such short-term thinking, that has such a narrow focus on the situation before them. It is indicative of a gross lack of vision. It's indicative of the complete lack of ambition for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia. Mr Deputy Speaker, in a few days this House is going to have the Close the Gap report before us again. Without preempting that report, I expect that, like years beforehand, that report is going to let down Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia gravely. Every one of us in this House should be deeply ashamed by the continued lack of process. I am hopeful that we might see some progress around some of the education indicators in Close the Gap. I am hopeful we might see some movement towards both secondary and higher education achievements for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in this country. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think we are all dreading that report, in the sense that there will be continued failures of government policy to have the desired impact and outcomes. You would think that the Australian Parliament might learn from these mistakes that we face year after year after year. You might think that those of us in this place may think, well, we're not getting it right when we simply seek to impose policy solutions in these communities. We've got any number of reports and examples to show that this is a pathway to failure. Yet, here we have before us another piece of legislation that I would argue does exactly that. Exactly what we know doesn't work. So, where is the plan for jobs in remote and regional Australia? Where are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people going to be getting their jobs, participating in mainstream economic activity, earning a livelihood to increase their quality of lives, and to have a decent income? There aren't any plans for that on the table. Where are those plans that are going to improve Indigenous health and well-being in Australia? For goodness sake, this government can't even commit to a housing agreement across the states and territories in Australia. Right now there are communities screaming out everywhere for safe, affordable housing options in their communities. We know that housing is one of those social determinants for quality health and well-being in our communities. But no, we've got no answer for jobs and employment for these communities that are crying out for some kind of support mechanisms. We've got no investment into important infrastructure like housing into these communities. We've got no sort of additional wraparound or adequately funded and long-term wraparound services that would assist people seeking to rehabilitation around alcohol, drugs and gambling addictions. That's not part of the government's thinking. That's not part of the plan here. No, and that is why I call this policy out as lazy policy. We see it far too often in this House, and nowhere is it made more clear than policies directed into First Nation peoples. each and every time this government says, you know, frankly, we don't know what to do, we're going to, we're going to throw this one out there and see how that goes, but don't worry, it'll just be a temporary measure. It's a bit of time out for these communities who are facing— I don't underestimate for one moment, Deputy Speaker, for the challenges that a number of these communities are facing, and people absolutely are crying out for support and help around those drug, alcohol and gambling addictions that are troubling not just to those individuals but to entire families and networks within communities. Don't underestimate that for one moment. But as I said, what is required in those situations are community-driven solutions. Community-driven solutions that are then supported by us in this House, supported both financially and indeed the other sorts of support in terms of infrastructure and encouragement around being able to assist communities to implement great community-driven solutions. Now, we've seen this in places like Fitzroy Crossing, you know, a place that I called home for many years in my life, Deputy Speaker. You know, some of the most amazing, predominantly women I have known, very strong Bunaba women who led, and not just Bunaba women, but who led really brave and courageous changes in their community to deal with the issue around alcohol, the impact that that was having for kids in their community in particular. They have managed to turn around a situation without, blaming particular persons or victimising, without socially isolating parts of their communities. They have engendered great community buy-in to the solutions in their town that are going to work to help turn around that alcohol addictions in Fitzroy Crossing. There's much evidence, and that story is now well documented. I say this House should be supporting those kinds of community-driven approaches and pathways that assist communities to empower their own peoples. They, in fact, know much better than most in this House what will work in those communities. Regretfully, what we have before us in this House is as I said, a very narrowly focused piece of legislation that purports to being a temporary measure, but we've seen what temporary measures are like in this House. They have a terrible habit of, decades going by and those temporary measures becoming permanent impositions in communities, chipping away slowly by slowly any efforts at self-management, any efforts to restore autonomy into families and community lives. We do people no favours when we disempower them. We do communities no favours when we do not support their own community-driven solutions and approaches. It is a great disappointment that we appear not to be learning from important lessons learned, shown to us in the past. If there was terrific community support backing in these proposals, if there was a body of strong evidence demonstrating the effectiveness of these proposals, then that would be a different conversation for this House. There have been many alternative approaches put before the Senate inquiry. Regretfully, we're not exploring those in this House. We're not looking at different ways that you might look at the, increasing taxation on alcohol to assist with those.
The member's time
again,
has expired.
and narrowly focused.
And the question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Petrie.
Support legislation amendment protecting children Bill 2017. Resumption of debate on the second reading.
And I call the member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I am very pleased to rise and speak to this piece of legislation before the House today, Family Assistance and Child Support Legislation Amendment Protecting Children Bill of 2017. This bill effectively gives effect to two distinct measures that were announced in the 2017 budget. The first one being around some of the new arrangements pertaining to the no jab, no pay, Healthy Start for School, and the other component relates to, well, indeed gives effects to the government's response to a 2015 report that was presented to this parliament following an inquiry held by the Social Policy and Legal Affairs Committee. I was Labor's deputy chair during that inquiry, and indeed that report was from conflict to cooperation that was lodged. That was back in 2015, so I am delighted that now in 2018, 3 years down the track, we have at least the beginnings of a response to some of the recommendations that were put forward during that very important inquiry into the child support payment system in Australia. I think just firstly, in relation to the part of this bill relating to no jab, no pay, I think it's important just at the outset to state very clearly that Labor has long supported this approach, and certainly we have no concerns regarding that component of the legislation, as indeed the majority of the recommendations around child support that appear in the Schedule 1 of the bill here. We do, and I will come back to this point in more detail after discussing the no jab, no pay component, but we do certainly share concerns. Indeed, the Shadow Minister and the member for Jagga Jagga earlier articulated Labor's concerns around the changes relating to amended tax assessments and potential overpayments. Really, the basis of that concern is that the child support recipients who have received those child support payments in completely good faith will have already expended those monies in caring for their children. And so it is very likely that there could be an unexpected debt owing, a debt that would arise for those parents, having, as I said, already expended that money and completely having received it in good faith and expended it on the care of their children. So that is an issue of concern, and as the member for Jagga Jagga made clear earlier on in this debate, that is an issue that we have taken up directly with both the former minister and indeed the current minister. We're awaiting further advice from the minister around our concerns, so we would reserve our final position there, including whether or not we would seek amendments in the Senate with this regard. But we are seeking further information on the potential impact of those changes. There are, as I said, some genuine concerns. We just need to have the government's position clarified there, and indeed make sure that those potential impacts are well known, and so that we are making well-informed decisions on this legislation now. But I will turn now to that first component of the bill around the no jab, no pay. As I said, Labor has absolutely no concerns about lending our support to this component of the bill. We certainly believe that every child in Australia deserves the best start in life possible, and we know and indeed support every effort in this place to better strengthen the immunisation rates in Australia. We on this side of the House absolutely back in the science in this regard. We have spoken out very loudly on many occasions when there have been some in this House, and indeed the other, who have been tempted to be critical of the issue around vaccinations and the good with which they serve in our community. And we've made very clear on each and every occasion that when it comes to vaccinations, we will always back in the science around the need to have high immunisation rates in Australia. And, you know, in government, Labor have made some important moves around the changes to family tax benefits that were designed to increase immunisation rates, and we indeed went to the 2013 election with some additional amendments there. And so the principles on which the current no jab, no pay policy are based have in fact enjoyed bipartisan support in this parliament for many, many years. And I think that we should remain very strong advocates, and I'm certainly pleased to see members opposite have shared this concern around the temptation that some people in the community have to get a bit lax on this or to start questioning the science around vaccinations. Certainly we know that the legislation before us now, in terms of the tightening up of some of the efforts to increase immunisation, go to an amount. The legislation is proposing to withhold an amount of $28 a fortnight from the Family Tax Benefit Part A to those families that don't meet the immunisation requirements. So that's really the fundamental change in this legislation. So the reduction in family tax benefits on a regular fortnightly basis would in fact replace the current system where you withhold the end-of-year tax supplement. And really effectively, I mean, the change in this legislation is necessary because we no longer, the abandonment of the end-of-year supplement has really necessitated a change in legislation to deal with the fact that the supplement no longer is there. So it's also necessary as families earning more than $80,000 a year are no longer eligible to receive that end-of-year supplement. That's really the main point I wish to make here, is that for those families earning more than $80,000 a year, this amendment is absolutely necessary in order to ensure that they too are feeling the the need to ensure that their children are indeed well covered and vaccinated as well. We know that vaccination remains the very best means we have to halt the spread of infectious diseases in Australia and to keep Australians healthy. We have strong immunisation rates here in Australia, and that has contributed to the eradication of many infectious diseases over time. And some children's vaccines were introduced in Australia as far back as 1932, and the deaths we've managed to decrease, deaths from vaccine-preventable diseases, have fallen by 99% since the introduction of vaccines. So no qualms from this side of the House in terms of the need to ensure that we have high rates of immunisation. We understand the science. We sort of understand the issues around herd immunity, and indeed we know that one of the most effective means of ensuring that everybody hears that message loud and clear from this parliament is to make these necessary changes now, so that the no jab, no pay changes will kick in, I understand, on the 1st of July. So no room for complacency on this issue, and we on this side of the House are very happy to back it in. I will just touch finally on some of the matters that came before the committee during the inquiry into the child support program. Indeed, there were 25 recommendations that the committee raised and have put to the government. Regretfully, this legislation looks at 3 of those recommendations, and whilst I certainly welcome some of those, the government finally belatedly acknowledging some of those required changes. As I said at the beginning, there are some concerns that we still have around some possible unintended consequences to those changes. I guess the first component that I'd really like to just look at is the proposed changes to the length of interim care payments and periods. Certainly, this part of Part 1 of the schedule really relates to those changes seeking to deal with the fact that the amount of that there can be fundamental discrepancies at times between parents who express there is a level of actual care that is going on within some of these families, and then there are some care arrangements that are also in place, which may or may not reflect the actual care being given. And disputes about care arrangements are indeed rife in the disputes more broadly amongst the child support system. But disputes about care arrangements are generally resolved by family law courts. Until this proposition, the Child Support Agency, for example, has not been able to enforce care arrangements. And certainly the inquiry received lots and lots of evidence around the discrepancies, as I said, between actual care provided and agreed care arrangements. Having said that, I would just like to put on the record again that the child support system in Australia, which today reaches, involves some 1.3 million parents and a payment system that's reaching some 1.1 million children in Australia, is a remarkable system in many ways. But we are dealing very often in these cases that this legislation is seeking to address with people who are caught in sometimes years of entrenched conflict and dealing with very complex issues and sometimes trauma and indeed very vulnerable families. That's the nature of a lot of family law in Australia. So these proposed changes to the length of interim care periods is one attempt to seek to address the issue that the 14 weeks, which is currently in place in terms of there is an arrangement that generally runs for this interim period of about 14 weeks, can in special circumstances be extended, but that period of time is generally not enough time for disputing parents to resolve their differences and indeed get a just and fair outcome in a 14-week period. I think anybody who has had experience of the family law system in Australia would understand that. So I think that the recommendations here in terms of those changes to interim care are worthwhile. I think I would just flag that currently there is still an exemption from participating in dispute resolution processes for those people who are experiencing domestic and family violence. I would put on notice here that I believe the government is seeking to change that component. Certainly in another unrelated inquiry around family law matters, it has been said that some of the alternative dispute resolution processes would absolutely reach out to people who have been who are victims of family and domestic violence. So I would put us all on alert in that matter. As I said at the outset, we just had some concerns around whether or not the other changes put up here would have some unintended consequences relating to a generation of a debt for over a matter which, you know, the receiving parent would have had absolutely no capacity to have known that would have been generating a debt, and having spent that money in good faith may be financially disadvantaged. We seek some government assurances that that would not be the case.
Thank you,